Good afternoon again, and welcome and congratulations for making it to level 4. And we're glad that you have. Today's day 27, day 27 out of 40 days in our 40-day challenge. So we're past the halfway mark, heading towards the summit. Right. So now let's talk about compliance and risk plans. This is important. All the things that we've talked about have been laying down the foundation, the concepts, the different components of the things that we might need to look at if we're going to create a plan for us to meet all our obligations, specifically those that are internal, that are voluntary in nature, that have more to do with outcomes and goals and objectives that we set for ourselves, rather than those that are purely based on regulatory external aspects. So we're going to just start at the beginning a little bit so that I can introduce where in our thinking compliance and risk plans fit in. So let's have a look at the mountain again. This is our mountain, our hierarchy of obligations. This is something that we've reviewed pretty much every challenge, and it begins at the bottom, at base camp, at the foundations. This is when companies and organizations accept legal responsibility for the things that they do. And this has to do with our regulatory license to operate. And these things are important. We need to do this. These tend to be prescriptive. They tend to be written in things such as legislation, acts, licenses, permits, orders of various sorts. And each country, each jurisdiction is going to be different, but they all tend to follow the same kind of rules. And as we move up the hierarchy, we find that we're getting closer to the pinnacle, which is accepting stakeholder responsibilities. And these have more to do with things which are voluntary and things that we choose to do, has more to do with our social license to operate than it does our regulatory license. And this happens through a progression. The first step is towards industry standards. It's typically how it's done. We have management standards. So we apply some management controls, management reviews. We standardize our processes. We make sure that we have proper governance, let's say, with the compliance programs that we may have related to things such as safety, environmental, and other domains in which we apply these standards. These are things that we want to conform to. As we move up the mountain, there's another level. This is the level of, let's say, industry regulation or industry goals and objectives. Every industry seems to be adopting something related to what you would call Vision Zero. This has to do with zero defects. We saw that with quality years ago. But now we're seeing it with respect to zero violations. This has to do with regulatory compliance, or zero incidents. We're talking about safety, or zero breaches when we're talking about cybersecurity, or zero emissions as we're talking about in our case study for this challenge with regards to environmental obligations. These things are objectives and targets that organizations choose to adopt, or they adopt because they are members of a particular industry association, let's say. And then finally, as we go to reach the summit, we're into a different world. In a sense, it has to do with stakeholders. And stakeholders mean, well, they're not just shareholders. No, they're also customers. They're also suppliers. They're the communities that we operate in. They're anyone that has a stake in what we do are looking into those kinds of expectations, and we call it ESG, or environmental sustainability and governance. And this has to do with whether we have the right overall commitment to the things that happen beyond the borders of our organization. And so these are the different levels, and as you can imagine, each one will have a different plan or a different strategy. You see, a plan is nothing more than a strategy. It's more than just a bunch of actions, of course. Those actions are important, and you're going to have tasks with every plan. And to some degree, today, we're not going to be looking at tasks. We'll be looking at, well, what are the characteristics of a plan? How do you pick a plan that's going to be successful, that will actually achieve the outcomes that you're hoping for? And as we move up the mountain, you're going to have things look a little differently. Your plan at the bottom level is going to be different. You're going to be focused more on closing gaps than anything else. But as you move up, you're going to need to have a plan to do something else. You need a plan to achieve consistency or reaching objectives or making progress and continuous improvement and those kinds of things. So today we're going to unpack the planning process as we go up the mountain of internal obligations. And as we know, for those that were with us last week, as we move up the mountain, we also increase the level of uncertainty. At the bottom, it's fairly clear, well, more than any time else, perhaps, that what the obligations might be, because they tend to be prescriptive and they're easy to audit. Well, they're easier to audit. We know if we've done something because we can just look and see if that's been done. But as we move up the mountain, well, things look a little differently. We're talking about capabilities and progress and trying to do continuous improvement to reach zero emissions, let's say. And while that looks a little differently and it's not so easy to audit and it's not so clear as to whether we're going to be successful, because it involves more than just documentation, let's say. It has to do with capability, both technically and management capabilities to achieve a particular objective or outcome. So this is something we need to pay attention to. So the risk increases. Go to the stakes. If we don't do these things, well, bad things can happen. Adverse conditions or events could occur. We want to prevent those. But we also want to ensure that we get the objectives that we want, the outcomes that we want, the good things that we're hoping for. We want those too. And so risk needs to incorporate those two things. We talked about that last week to some degree. So plans, they have different objectives. At the top, we're talking about things associated with measures of conformance. Measures of conformance. These are the things that we do that provide evidence of compliance. The things that, do we have an SOP? Yes, we have one. The SOP is a demonstration of conformance. Do we have training? Yes, the training records become the measures of conformance. And these are things that you might do, and while your goal might be to close the gaps. You may not be conforming in the areas that you want to. And you may use things like PDCA, perhaps, or quality people would use CAPA. They're all kind of the same thing. When we find a gap, we close it. And then we make sure that gap doesn't reappear. Well, that's the goal. That's the hope. When we're at this level, while we're assuming the others, things are in place. We assume that we have the capabilities to achieve the required level of performance. And the thing that we're missing, the thing that we're lacking here is consistency. Consistency. We get holes that pop up now and again, and we want to make sure that we close those gaps. So this is something you do maybe not even at the beginning, but at the end of a compliance program, when you've got everything else in place and you're just trying to make sure that you've stay that way. It's interesting that this is often the first place where compliance starts, though. They start with closing gaps rather than the other two, and I'm going to talk about those now. So the second area, as we move down here, is to achieve measures of performance. Performance. This has to do with capabilities to some degree, but it has to do with whether or not we have the processes in place to perform in order to achieve the outcomes that we need. And so this assumes that we have the capabilities, but not the consistency or the performance to stay between the lines. Maybe we're looking at carbon dioxide emissions and, well, we have the capability, but it's all over the map. We're not able to keep it to where it needs to be. So we don't have effective controls. And so that's what we want to do at this level is we want a plan to establish effective controls. That's what we want to do. We also have the third category of plans. These are plans that are more comprehensive. These have to do with achieving measures of effectiveness. Measures effectiveness. You see, it's possible to have a great compliance program on the environmental front, but still fail to actually reduce your impact on the environment. And that's because we don't have the capabilities that we need either to perform or to be consistent in achieving effective compliance. You know about capabilities is that if you want to change your outcomes, you need to change your capabilities because it's capabilities that drive outcomes. So these are the three different kinds of objectives that you might have. It'll be up to you to figure out where you are at with regards to your compliance program. And that depends on where you are on the mountain. The further up you go, the more you may need to spend time on making sure you have the capabilities. And maybe you're at the summit or close to it, and your challenge is consistency, and so you need to focus on having effective controls. Controls are nothing more than processes. They're processes that do something. They have a purpose. They either prevent things from happening or they ensure that things happen. And then, well, maybe you're already there and you just want to make sure that you don't fall off the mountain. Close those gaps, don't fall in a chasm. So that's something to think about. What kind of plan do you need? I've talked about these in the past. We have three different measures of compliance that we typically talk about. We talk about measures of effectiveness, and this has to do with our progress towards an outcome. In our case, zero emissions. So this is an outcome of compliance. This is why we're doing the program. It's to get closer to zero emissions. But we also have measures of performance. And this has to do with our ability to even achieve zero emissions. And this has to do with either technical or management capabilities. Do we have what it takes? Do we have the technical processes? Do we have the management processes in order to perform at an adequate level in order to achieve progress? And then last, we have the measures of conformance. Measures of conformance. These are the ones that are pretty much well known to people. These are evidence of compliance. These are, do we have the training records? Do we have the operator logs? Do we have the equipment logs? And these are evidence of compliance. And of course, what we're doing here is we're verifying that we are meeting our obligations. And so we have these three different kinds of measures. And well, depending on what kind of plan you have, you're going to want to focus on either all of them or some of them. Plan consists of objectives. That's what plans are. They're a list of objectives to advance a particular measure or all of them measures of compliance. That's what your plan needs to do. That's the purpose of the plan. I wanted to also communicate the distinction between what some of you may be familiar with, which is a project plan. And they're important. We're going to talk about that today, and it'll be part of your challenge for this week. But that's not the only kind of plan that you can have. You need a plan for continuous improvement. And that's another kind of plan. And they're both different, and we're going to do that one next week. That'll be next week's challenge. We'll be talking about continuous improvement plans. And the difference is projects, by and large, are there to deliver new capabilities that you need to advance the outcomes or to achieve the benefits of your compliance. So they can be technical in nature, they could be management. You need to think about both, especially when we're talking about environmental safety as well. All of them, they have a technical component to it, for sure. They also have a management component. You're going to think of as managing the technical side. If you want to introduce new capabilities, you usually create a project to do that. You don't typically do that through continuous improvement. Projects are discrete, which means they have a beginning and they have an end. And they have the means, which is what you do between the beginning and the end. So they start and they have an end. They have a goal. They have a purpose. They have a place they want to get to. They have something they want to achieve. And when they achieve it, well, then they're done. Then they're done. And it requires planning. Everything happens in the presence of uncertainty. So a plan has to consider the effects of the dragon of uncertainty that we talked about last week. We need not just the happy plan, the plan that assumes that everything's going to go right and nothing ever goes wrong. Those are the ones we typically create, but we need what we call a risk-adjusted plan. It's the happy plan that also considers the effects of uncertainty on our objectives. So that's going to be important. Now, on the continuous improvement side, well, things are a little different. It's typically not there to improve capabilities, but perhaps to enhance them, to make sure that we stay between the lines more consistently and maybe at a higher level of performance. That's what continuous improvement does. It assumes you've already got the equipment and you've got the management processes in place. They're just not performing and not consistent enough. And they have gaps. And so you want to do continuous improvement to kind of address those kinds of issues. They have a beginning. You have to start sometime. And they have a means. They have a process. The process is going to be different than a project process. In case of continuous improvement, it never ends. You know, when we get to zero, it's not that we'll ever get to zero emissions. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, but it's in the pursuit of that goal that drives operational excellence and improves greater resiliency for organizations. Just as it did for quality and defects, the same thing is true when it comes to compliance. And so this is really an important thing. Many companies, they don't know how to deal with continuous improvement. That's why we're going to talk about it next week, because as far as they're concerned, there's no continuous improvement with compliance. We're either in compliance or we're out of compliance. There are only gaps to close. There's nothing to improve. And that's not the right way to think about it. And I hope that you've come to that conclusion yourself over the course of the recent weeks as we've unpacked internal obligations. And finally, before we kind of continuous improvement also happens in the presence of uncertainty. And therefore, we need a risk-adjusted process plan by which we can continuously improve. Projects create opportunities for compliance outcomes. That's what they do. Projects create opportunities for compliance outcomes. And it does that by establishing new capabilities, the capabilities that create the opportunities. Now, continuous improvement increases the probability of compliance outcomes. So it takes the opportunities and it either increases the probability that we get the outcomes that we want, or it exploits those opportunities to get more of it, to happen. So that's another way of looking at it. They're both extremely important, and you're going to need to do both in your planning. And we're going to look at it in terms of these 5 principles, 5 questions. So when we think about plans, we think about plans in the context of things that begin and things that end, which we call them projects. They all have to answer these 5 questions. These have been developed over time, over decades. These are the 5 questions that every person that's created a plan goes through. You need compelling answers to these questions. Compelling answers, thoughtful answers, comprehensive answers to these questions. So let's go through them. So in question number 1, what does done look like? That's a good question. How do we know when we're done? Right? How do we know that when we our destination? What does that look like? When are we going to be finished? You know, one of the things that my kids learned when they were young, and it wasn't too long after we left the driveway when we went on a road trip to visit someone, The idea of visiting someone sounds so foreign these days in terms of the coronavirus pandemic. But there was a time when that we used to do that kind of thing, and the kids would say, "Dad, are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And they would ask that question all the way from the time we started to the time we got to where we needed to go. So that's an important question, and so we need to know where there is. Otherwise, we'll never answer that question. Are we there yet? Because we don't know what there looks like. So we need to define what done looks like. Number two, how do we get there? Right? That's our plan. We need a way of getting there. What is the strategy we're going to use? Now, that could be a series of steps, of course, but we need to plan these. They have to be coordinated. They have to make sure that we have enough time, resources, and money to get there. That's number three. That's important too. Is our plan realistic? Can we do it with the constraints that we have out there? Or are we just doing the effort, adding effort to a problem, and then we get whatever results we get? And many companies, they think about compliance in the same way. Just keep working at it, do the best you can, and we hope for the best. We hope for the best. But hope is a wonderful thing, as we learned last week, and it's not always the best strategy. In fact, it's never the best strategy when it comes to dealing with uncertainty. And so we have to ask question number 4. What impediments will we encounter along the way? There's going to be obstacles. There's going to be challenges, as many of you found these challenges over the 40 days. There's going to be things you need to do that you might not have expected, and well, they've hindered your progress. And we started at the beginning of today's call, and we looked at the number of people working on the challenges over time, and we go, well, there's a lot of things hindering their progress. So what are we going to do about that? And then how do we know we're making any progress at all? Making any progress at all. The questions I'm often asked, and we're often asked in regards to compliance, is we're doing all these things, we're maintaining our registers, we're doing audits, but are we making any progress? Is it enough? Are we actually advancing the outcomes associated with being in compliance? Are we generating the trust that would be engendered from companies that are keeping their promises with respect to the environment? Let's say, what does that look like? And, are we making any progress? Are we having any impact whatsoever? So these are the 5 questions, and you're going to be answering these questions in your challenge for this week. So we're going to, unpack this a little bit more. When we come to the question of what does done look like, number 1, we often describe it in terms of capabilities. What capabilities do we need in our organization so that we can continuously meet all our obligations all the time, today and in the future, for as long as we're going to operate? What does that look like? What does that look like? And we have to find a way of talking about it in terms that are meaningful to the stakeholders, the people that have a stake in what we're doing, not just in terms of, our own measures, like the number of obligations we might have in our register or the amount of risk that we've identified. But what does it look like for the stakeholders? And stakeholders, like I said, is the broad term of stakeholders, right? It's shareholders, yes. Investors, yes. But they're workers too, and vendors and suppliers and customers and the communities in which we work. All of them have a stake in what's going on. So we have to find a way of talking about it in terms of things that are meaningful to them. We also, how do we get there? Well, that's our plan. This is our plan to get to done. But if you don't know what done looks like, there's no way you can come up with a plan. And then number 3, do we have enough time, resources, and money to get to where we want to go? That's our budget. Is it realistic? Can we afford it? Does it produce outcomes, does it realize the benefits that would warrant the investment? And we don't talk about compliance in terms of investment often enough. We think about it purely as a cost, as an expenditure that we somehow have to pay back. It's actually an investment. It saves money, yes, but it also creates opportunities for things which are important. It protects value. It protects value. And now we're talking about protecting the environment. That's important as well. So is the budget commensurate with, let's say, the outcomes, with the benefits? Number 4, what impediments do we have along the way? Well, this is our risk plan. This is how we ensure, how we make sure that we get there. We need that because everything has obstacles, everything has uncertainty. Things happen. Sometimes we can predict it and sometimes we can't. But even the ones we can't, we can still include margins to protect us in case of nonconformance. We can still do that. How do we know we're making any progress? We need a way of evaluating our progress in units of measure that are meaningful to the stakeholder. It's something that we often fail to do. These are the 5 questions. These are the things that we need to think about when we create our plan. Now we're ready to talk about your plan. We're going to introduce this week's challenge, closing the challenge gaps. All of you that have been participating have no doubt have been working through the challenges, and from what we've heard and from what we've observed is that not everyone has been able to complete all their objectives. So there's going to be gaps. So let's talk about putting together a plan to work to complete them. This is our scorecard. These are the different challenges. And this week we're on challenge number 5. We're going to be talking about that. And every week we ask that you make an estimate of where you were at the beginning of the challenge. You see, a plan has to take that into consideration. A plan to get from 0 to 5 is a different plan to get from 0 to 1. It's a different plan. So knowing where you are, how far away you are to your destination is an important aspect of our planning. So we asked you to do that. We then asked you to come up with an assessment as to where were you at the end of that challenge? How far did you get? And if you take the difference of that, you get a measure of improvement. And I filled in some values here just as an example. And well, for the first week, we got an improvement of 2, and then, well, the next week didn't go so well. So we only went from 0 to 1. Then if you add these up, you end up with an improvement score of 12. So that's important. That tells you how far we've come, right? And in a sense, that's a measure of progress. But that's not where we want to end up. You can get from 0 to 5. And so what we'd like you to do is to think about that across all these different compliance aspects. Did you get all the obligation sources for your internal obligations? Did you identify them all? Figure out what the gap is and where it is that you want to be. Do the same for obligations and metadata that comes from those obligation sources. Identify those gaps. Then think about, in terms of your register, did you get as far as you wanted to get to or that you need to be in order to manage both obligations and risk at the same time within the same register? Maybe that's what you want to do. And then, well, with risk, last week, we know that not many people were able to evaluate the risk. So you may need to go back there and figure out, well, there's a bigger gap. We don't know really how to do this properly, and it's important. Otherwise, we don't know which obligations really matter. What we'd like you to do is go through your previous weeks and come up with a consolidated list of gaps. And maybe if you've joined us just this week and you're trying to catch up, well, this is your chance because you're going to have gaps across all the others. And that's fine. That's fine. So your plan is going to be more larger than some of the others, and that's okay. And maybe you only bite off part of it. maybe you'll decide where you want to be. That's different. Maybe you're just going to take out one component. So that's the essence of what we're trying to do, is consolidate your gaps and then create a plan for how you're going to close those gaps. So then you're going to ask these questions and come up with answers. And I've done that. I've come up with answers, at least some beginnings of one, to give you an idea of what kinds of things you might want to think about. For the first one, what does done look like? This is the most important part. This is the one that really matters. If you don't get this right, well, then your plan isn't going to be successful. Your done looks like this. Measures of compliance are identified with defined audit protocols for all high-risk internal obligations. Okay, well, that's good. That's a good outcome, or that's a good definition of done. It's okay. We have measures of compliance, so we know what we're trying to achieve, what the targets are, whether that's conformance, performance, or effectiveness. We know what those are. We know as we go up to different levels of the hierarchy of obligations, we're going to run into those measures of effectiveness more often. So, we need to talk about those. So we've got that in here. We want to have an audit protocol to validate, perhaps, or verify that we're doing those things, that we're actually doing what we said we're going to do. So that's good to have that tied to those measures of compliance. That would be excellent. And then, well, we'll do that for the high risk ones, which means that we have to evaluate risk on all of them, but we're only going to focus on high risk. You might be happy with that. And then, of course, you can come up with a plan to get there. And how much resources, time, money, people, what's your budget going to be to get there? And maybe you can afford it, maybe you can't, or maybe you're going to do half of them or something like that. You could decide based on what you can afford or what you want to invest. And then you need a plan to ensure you're going to get there, how you're going to deal with risk. Not the risk of the obligations. This is the risk in achieving your plan, right? So you're basically looking at the objective in terms of what done is and thinking about it in those terms, like, what's the risk that this isn't going to happen? Like, you're not going to get any support. There's no more budget. There's no more people. It's just going to be you. So you're going to need to plod along. And maybe that's enough, and maybe that's okay, but maybe it isn't. Maybe there's some things you can do to improve the probability of success. So that's number 4. Number 5, well, how do we know when we're making any progress? We're going to look at the number of high-risk obligations identified in the obligations register, so we can count those. And maybe that's a good measure of how much progress we've made. And maybe that's okay. In fact, that's all what I'm going to say about this one. It's okay. And this is what we typically see. But this is only okay. We can do better than this. And what does better look like? Here it is. So remember when I started at the beginning, I said, when we talk about done, we need to use measures that are meaningful to the stakeholders. Meaningful to the stakeholders. So the number of obligations I have in my register, or how many of them have audit protocols, those are meaningful to me. They're interest to my compliance group, my audit function. Those are important to us, but they're not important to the stakeholders. So I've restated it in the following way. I think this is better. What done looks like is that we've achieved a 20% reduction in CO2 emissions associated with operations at the Montreal facility by 2025. That's what done looks like in terms of what's meaningful to the stakeholders. What are they concerned about? CO2 emissions. Not that you're following every I dotted or T crossed, and that you're following all your 14,000 ISO standard elements. Those things are important. They're important to you, important to me, perhaps, but they're not necessarily as important to the stakeholders. So this is what done looks like. connects with CO2 emissions. So as we measure the actual versus planned, that's going to tell us if we're making any progress. What's the trend? Are we going down or are we going up? Right? We'll know that. This is better. So a plan to do this is going to be different than the plan that is trying to count or achieve a certain number of identified obligations in a risk register or an obligations register. It's important, but this is better. This is better. Okay, so I gave you an example. We'll send out the slides so that you have them to work through these questions. Your next challenge. Challenge number 5, identify the gaps at each one of the challenges. Create a plan for how you're going to complete the challenge. That's good. If you can do that, that would be wonderful.